I'm so hungry, she whispered, and without a second thought, a broke single dad split his only sandwich with her, not knowing she was the powerful bank CEO about to take everything he had. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thin curtains of the Harper home, casting weak shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Wade Harper's eyes opened before his alarm, a habit formed from years of early mornings at the garage. The springs of his old mattress creaked as he sat up, his joints protesting the cold that had settled into the house overnight. He pulled on his work shirt, the fabric thin from countless washes, and made his way to the kitchen. The floorboards whispered beneath his careful steps. He didn't want to wake Ellie just yet. Let her have those few extra minutes of peaceful sleep. In the kitchen, Wade opened the refrigerator door, its yellow light illuminating more empty space than food. His eyes settled on the nearly empty jar of peanut butter and the few remaining slices of bread on the counter. The sight made his chest tighten, but he pushed the feeling aside. Worry wouldn't fill their cupboards. "Morning, Daddy!" Ellie's cheerful voice broke through his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, already dressed in her favorite purple sweater, her backpack clutched in her small hands. Wade's face softened into a smile. "Morning, sunshine, sleep well?" "Uh-huh." She bounced over to him, her dark curls swaying. "What's for breakfast?" Wade's hands moved deliberately as he spread the peanut butter on a single slice of bread, then folded it over. "We're having a special breakfast today," he said, cutting the sandwich in precise halves. "Remember how Mom used to say, sharing makes everything taste better?" Ellie's eyes brightened at the mention of her mother. "She always shared her cookies with me, even when they were her favorite kind." "That's right." Wade handed her half of the sandwich. And you know what? She was absolutely right about sharing. They sat at their small kitchen table, the morning light growing stronger. Wade watched as Ellie took small, careful bites, making her portion last. His heart swelled with pride and ached with worry all at once. She was so young, yet sometimes showed wisdom beyond her years. "Ready for school?" Wade asked as they finished their modest breakfast. Ellie nodded, already heading for the door. The walk to school was their special time. Ellie chattered about her upcoming art project while Wade listened intently, his large hand holding her small one. The foreclosure notice burned in his back pocket like a hot coal, but he kept his voice steady and his smile genuine. "And Mrs. Thompson says we can use any colors we want," Ellie continued, jumping over a crack in the sidewalk. "I'm thinking purple and gold, like a sunset." "That sounds beautiful, sweetheart." Wade squeezed her hand. "You've got your mother's eye for color." At the school gates, Ellie hugged him tight. "Love you, Daddy. Love you too, sunshine. Have a great day." He watched until she disappeared into the building, then turned toward the town park, his remaining half sandwich carefully wrapped in a napkin. The park was quiet this early, with only a few joggers passing through. Wade found an empty bench and sat down, his shoulders heavy with the weight of unsaid worries. The foreclosure notice seemed to pulse in his pocket, each beat a reminder of his failure to keep their little world intact. He unwrapped his sandwich half, studying it without appetite. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of approaching winter. A well-dressed woman appeared, her heels clicking against the path as she approached the bench. Despite her expensive clothing, her face showed signs of exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes visible even through carefully applied makeup. She sat heavily on the other end of the bench, her briefcase landing with a thud beside her. A small sigh escaped her lips as she leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. Wade noticed her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her phone. After a few moments, her stomach growled audibly. She pressed a hand against it, looking embarrassed. Without hesitation, Wade extended his hand, offering his half sandwich. "Here," he said simply. The woman stared at him, surprise evident in her features. "Oh, no, I couldn't. Please," Wade insisted quietly. "Sounds like you need it more than I do right now." She hesitated for another moment before accepting the wrapped sandwich. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of genuine gratitude. She took a small bite, then another, eating slowly and deliberately. Wade sat in comfortable silence, watching a pair of sparrows hop across the path. The woman finished the last bite and carefully folded the napkin. "I'm Judith," she said finally, turning to look at him with an expression of quiet admiration. Wade nodded, offering a small smile. "When you got nothing, kindness is the only thing you can afford." The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the elementary school's front lawn as Wade waited among other parents. His weathered hands were stuffed deep in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched against the autumn chill. The moment the bell rang, children burst through the double doors like confetti from a party popper. Ellie's bright yellow backpack bobbed through the crowd. Her face lit up when she spotted her father, and she ran toward him, pigtails bouncing with each step. "Dad, Dad, you won't believe what we did in class today." Wade's tired face softened into a gentle smile as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Well now, what's got you so excited, sweetheart?" "We're making a hope tree." Ellie practically danced beside him as they started their walk home. "Mrs. Matthews brought in this big paper tree for our classroom wall, and we all get to write down good things we see people do on paper leaves." "That sounds real nice," Wade said, carefully steering her around a crack in the sidewalk. Ellie tugged at his sleeve. "And I know exactly what I'm going to write about." Her eyes sparkled with pride. "I'm going to write about you giving your sandwich away this morning." Wade stopped walking. "How did you? I saw you from the school bus when we were coming back from our field trip to the library." Ellie's voice grew softer. "That lady looks so sad, Dad. But then you shared your lunch with her, and she smiled." She squeezed his hand. "That's what hope looks like, right?" Wade swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Some things are meant to be private, honey. Sometimes kindness is better kept quiet." "But Mrs. Matthews says good deeds inspire more good deeds." Ellie kicked a pebble along the sidewalk, like ripples in a pond when you throw in a stone. They walked in comfortable silence for a few blocks, passing shuttered storefronts that had once been busy shops. The town's decline was visible in the empty windows and faded "for lease" signs. At home, Wade pulled out their dented rice cooker and a can of beans from the nearly empty pantry. Ellie helped him measure the rice, her small fingers careful with each scoop, the kitchen filled with the homey smell of cooking rice, masking the worry that hung in the air. "Dad?" Ellie stirred the beans on the stovetop, standing on her tiptoes to reach. "Is the garage going to be okay?" Wade's hand trembled slightly as he reached for 2 chipped plates. "Course it will, sweetie. Everything's going to be just fine." The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but he forced a reassuring smile. "Promise?" Her eyes, so much like her mother's, searched his face. "Promise." He ruffled her hair, hating himself for the deception. "Now, let's eat before these beans get cold." They sat at their small kitchen table, the overhead light flickering occasionally. Ellie chatted about her day, about Tommy's new puppy and Sarah's lost tooth, while Wade nodded at all the right moments, his mind wandering to the letter in his desk drawer. After dinner, Wade helped Ellie with her math homework, tucked her into bed, and read her favorite chapter from their worn copy of Charlotte's Web. When her breathing finally settled into the rhythm of sleep, he gently closed her door and walked to his tiny home office. The foreclosure notice sat where he'd left it, stark white against the dark wood of his desk. Wade lowered himself into his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His callous fingers traced the embossed Ridgebank logo at the top of the page. Final Notice of Foreclosure. The words hadn't changed since yesterday, or the day before. The amount owed hadn't magically decreased. The deadline, just 2 weeks away, hadn't extended itself. Wade ran his hands over his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath his palms. How could he tell Ellie they might lose not just the garage, but their home? The mortgage on the house was tied to the business loan. When one went, both went. He'd built that garage from nothing, turning it into something his grandfather would have been proud of. Now it was slipping through his fingers like water. Across town, in the Renaissance Hotel's premium suite, Judith Maynard sat in front of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. A room service cart stood nearby, the silver dome still covering a barely touched meal that cost more than Wade's entire day of food. She couldn't shake the image of the man from the park, his quiet dignity, the way he'd shared his meager lunch without hesitation or expectation, the simple grace in his words about kindness. Her laptop hummed softly as she opened it. The Ridgebank internal database welcomed her with its familiar blue interface. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing, "Wade Harper." The search results appeared instantly. Foreclosure ID 247891. Harper's Auto Repair and Restoration. Owner, Wade Harper. Status, final notice issued. Judith stared at the screen, the sandwich from this morning sitting heavy in her memory. She thought about the way his hands had broken that simple peanut butter sandwich so carefully, sharing what little he had while facing the loss of everything. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost crystallizing on windshields across town. Wade and Ellie walked their familiar route to school, their breath forming little clouds in the cold air. Ellie skipped ahead, stopping every few feet to examine something that caught her eye. A particularly crunchy leaf, a sparkly patch of frost, or a brave flower still blooming despite the cold. "Dad, look!" Ellie pointed to a cardinal perched on a nearby fence. "It's so red against all the brown." Wade smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sure is, sweetheart. Nature's got its own way of bringing color to gray days." After dropping Ellie off with a tight hug and watching her disappear into the school building, Wade turned toward the park. He hadn't planned to return to yesterday's bench, but his feet carried him there anyway. The morning sun had barely begun to warm the wooden slats when he sat down. He closed his eyes, letting the weak sunlight wash over his face. The sound of footsteps crunching on fallen leaves made him look up. There stood Judith, looking different from yesterday, still elegant in her tailored coat, but somehow softer around the edges. She carried a paper bag in her hands. "Good morning," she said, a tentative smile on her face. "I hoped I might find you here." Wade straightened, touching the brim of his worn baseball cap. "Ma'am, please, it's just Judith." She held up the paper bag. "I brought breakfast. Several kinds of sandwiches, actually. I wasn't sure what you might like." Wade's first instinct was to decline, but something in her expression made him pause. She wasn't offering charity. There was a question in her eyes, almost a plea. "That's mighty thoughtful of you," he said, moving over to make room on the bench. Judith sat down, placing the bag between them. "Actually, I had an ulterior motive," she admitted, pulling out wrapped sandwiches. "I'm doing interviews for a human interest article about small towns and economic challenges. Would you mind talking with me?" Wade accepted a sandwich, noting how she'd chosen quality bread and fresh ingredients. "Not sure I'd have much to say. That's interesting." "I think you would." Judith pulled out a small notebook. "Yesterday, you showed more kindness to a stranger than most people show their friends. That says something about who you are, about this community." Wade unwrapped his sandwich slowly, considering his words. "Ma'am, Judith, kindness isn't something special around here. It's just how folks get by." "Tell me about that," she prompted, pen poised over paper. Wade looked out across the park, where early morning, joggers circled the path and an elderly man threw breadcrumbs to gathering pigeons. "Well, take Miller's Pharmacy down on Oak Street. Tom Miller lets people run tabs when times are tight, never charges interest. Sarah at the diner feeds anybody who's truly hungry, whether they can pay or not. We look out for each other because we have to." "And your business, Harper Automotive, isn't it?" Judith's voice remained casual, but Wade noticed how intently she watched his face. "Yes, ma'am. Been fixing cars there 23 years now." Pride crept into his voice, despite his attempt to remain modest. "My daddy started it back in '62. Taught me everything I know about engines and people." "What did he teach you about people?" Wade smiled, remembering. He always said every car that comes in has a person depending on it. Maybe it's a mama who needs to get her kids to school, or someone trying to keep their job 2 towns over. When you fix a car, you're helping that person keep their life running. Judith's pen moved quickly across the paper. "That's a beautiful way to look at it. Has it been difficult keeping the business going?" Wade's smile faded slightly. "Times aren't what they used to be. Big chains moved in out by the highway. Parts cost more, but folks can't afford to pay more. You do what you can with what you have." "And what keeps you going?" Judith asked softly. Wade was quiet for a moment, brushing crumbs from his lap. "Faith," he said finally. "Faith in God, faith in people. My little girl, Ellie, she's got this way of seeing good in everything. Makes you want to live up to what she sees. She sounds special." "She is." Wade's voice grew warm. "Yesterday she was telling me about this hope tree they're making at school, writing down good things they see people do. Simple stuff, but it matters to her." Judith's pen had stopped moving. She was just listening now, her eyes fixed on Wade's face. "Sometimes I think that's what we're missing nowadays," Wade continued. "People looking for the good in each other. Getting so caught up in numbers and bottom lines, we forget there's hearts beating behind them." Judith's hand tightened on her pen. "Yes," she said quietly. "We do forget that." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Finally, Judith closed her notebook and stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. You've given me a lot to think about." She gathered her things, leaving the remaining sandwiches on the bench. "Please, take these. Share them with Ellie." Wade touched his cap again. "Thank you kindly." Judith walked away, her heels clicking on the park path. When she reached her car, a sleek black sedan that spoke of corporate success, she sat behind the wheel for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Legal department, please." she said crisply. "This is Judith Maynard. I need to temporarily halt foreclosure proceedings on Harper Automotive for documentation review." The old heater in Harper Automotive gave one last rattling wheeze before falling silent. Wade's breath formed visible puffs in the frigid air as he stood in the dimly lit garage, staring at the ancient heating unit mounted on the wall. He'd nursed it along for 3 winters now, but this time felt different, final. "It's okay, Dad," Ellie said from her usual spot at the worn desk in the corner. "I've got my extra sweater on." She held up her colored pencils, already wearing the thick purple sweater her father had bought at the thrift store last month. Her small fingers were pink from the cold, but she kept drawing, determined, as always. Wade's chest tightened. He'd wanted to keep her at school today, where it was warm, but with no afternoon programs running and nobody to watch her, this was their only option. He grabbed his toolbox and got back to work on Mrs. Jensen's old Buick, trying to ignore how the cold metal burned against his hands. The phone rang, its sharp trill echoing through the concrete space. Ellie jumped up to answer it, playing secretary just like she loved to do. "Harper Automotive, this is Ellie speaking." Her professional tone made Wade smile, despite everything, but the smile faded as he watched her face fall slightly. "Oh, okay, Mr. Peterson. Yes, I'll tell him. Feel better." She hung up and turned to Wade. "Mr. Peterson says his car won't start because of the cold, so he can't bring it in today." She paused. "That was our only appointment, wasn't it?" Wade nodded, forcing a reassuring smile. "More time to catch up on other work. Sunshine." He didn't mention that, Mr. Peterson was their only scheduled customer for the entire week. The morning crawled by. Wade worked methodically on Mrs. Jensen's car, while Ellie drew picture after picture, occasionally blowing on her hands to warm them. The only sounds were the clink of tools and the scratch of colored pencils on paper. Just before noon, the bell above the door chimed. A man in a crisp navy suit walked in, looking severely out of place among the oil-stained concrete and old tools. He carried a leather portfolio and wore an ID badge that read, "City Inspector." "Mr. Harper?" The man's voice was clipped, professional. "I'm Thomas Reed from the Department of Building Safety. We've had some concerns about this facility." Wade's stomach dropped, but he kept his voice steady. "What kind of concerns?" "Routine inspection," Reed said, though his expression suggested otherwise. He pulled out a clipboard and began moving through the garage, making notes and taking pictures with his phone. Wade watched helplessly as the inspector documented every crack in the concrete, every outdated fire extinguisher, every non-compliant electrical outlet. Ellie had stopped drawing, her eyes wide as she watched the inspector work. Wade gave her what he hoped was a convincing wink, but his hands were trembling slightly as he wiped them on his work rack. After 20 minutes, Reed cleared his throat. "Mr. Harper, I'm afraid there are several code violations that need immediate attention." He began reading from his list. "Insufficient ventilation system, outdated electrical wiring, non-compliant waste oil disposal system, missing emergency lighting." The list went on. Each item felt like another nail in the garage's coffin. Wade knew the cost of fixing even one of these violations would be more than he could manage. "You have 7 days to bring these items up to code," Reed concluded, tearing off a carbon copy of his report. "Failure to comply will result in immediate closure of the facility." Wade took the paper, careful to keep his face neutral. "Thank you for your time," he managed to say. As soon as the inspector left, Ellie bounded over. "What did he say, Dad? Is everything okay?" Wade quickly folded the paper and tucked it into his back pocket. "Just some paperwork, sunshine, nothing to worry about." The lie tasted bitter in his mouth, but he couldn't bear to see fear in those trusting eyes. "How about you show me what you've been drawing?" Ellie's face lit up as she retrieved her latest artwork. While she explained the detailed scene, she'd created a bright summer day with butterflies and flowers. Wade's mind raced through calculations he'd already done 100 times. There was no way to afford these repairs, not with the bank breathing down his neck, not with winter killing his business. The afternoon passed in a blur of cold fingers and worried thoughts. Wade sent Ellie home with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Martinez, when school would have normally ended, promising to be home for dinner. Then he stayed, working late into the night, trying to squeeze a few more dollars out of the repairs he could still complete. The garage lights cast harsh shadows across the empty parking lot as Wade hunched over engines and crawled under cars. His fingers were numb, his back ached, but he kept working. Each turn of a wrench felt like fighting against an impossible tide, but he couldn't stop. This garage wasn't just a building, it was his father's legacy, Ellie's future. their only chance. Outside in the growing darkness, Judith sat in her car, watching the solitary figure move through the garage. The heat in her luxury vehicle was running full blast, but she felt cold watching Wade work in the freezing building. His determination was visible even from a distance. The way he kept going, despite everything. The way he protected his daughter from harsh realities. The way he offered kindness, even when he had nothing left to give. She gripped her steering wheel tighter, whispering into the darkness of her car, "You deserve better." The Saturday morning sun cast long shadows across the church parking lot as Wade and Ellie made their way up the worn concrete steps. Wade's shoulders hunched slightly, his work-roughened hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets. He'd never imagined himself here, needing help from the food pantry, but Ellie's needs came before his pride. "Look, Dad." Ellie pointed to the colorful paper chains decorating the church entrance. "We made those in Sunday school last week." Her breath formed little clouds in the crisp morning air, but her smile was warm enough to melt winter itself. Pastor Neil stood at the entrance, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he greeted everyone by name. His silver hair caught the morning light, and his well-worn sweater had seen better days, but somehow he always managed to look dignified. "Wade, Ellie?" Pastor Neil's voice carried genuine warmth as he stepped forward to shake Wade's hand. "So good to see you both this morning." Ellie gave the pastor a quick hug before darting inside to where other children were playing in the church's community room. Wade watched her go, grateful for her resilient spirit. "Wade," Pastor Neil said softly, pressing an envelope into his hand, "a donor asked me to give this to you, and before you say no," he added, seeing Wade's expression, "remember that sometimes being blessed allows us to bless others." Wade's throat tightened as he felt the envelope's contents. $40, that would mean the difference between having gas in his truck or walking to work next week. "Pastor, just say thank you, Wade," Pastor Neil said gently. "That's all the donor wants." Inside the church basement, volunteers moved efficiently between shelves, stocked with canned goods and dry staples. The space smelled of coffee and fresh-baked cookies someone had brought for the volunteers. Wade noticed a familiar figure among them. The woman from the park, Judith, was carefully arranging boxes of cereal on a shelf. She wore simple jeans and a sweater today instead of her usual business attire, but something about her still seemed out of place among the other volunteers. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, as if she was trying too hard to appear casual. Ellie's voice carried across the room as she played with two other children near the craft table. "My daddy fixed Mrs. Johnson's car last week, even though she couldn't pay right away," she was saying proudly. "He said sometimes people need help more than we need money." Judith's hands stilled on the cereal box she was holding. Her face remained carefully composed, but something flickered in her eyes, a mix of admiration and what looked surprisingly like pain. "And last month," Ellie continued, her small voice clear in the quiet space, "when Mr. Peters' wheelchair broke, Daddy stayed late 3 nights, fixing it perfect, even though Mr. Peters could only pay with homemade bread." Wade busied himself selecting items from the shelves, pretending not to hear his daughter's words. But he noticed how Judith's movements had become less certain, her fingers trembling slightly as she arranged the boxes. The morning continued quietly. Families came and went, receiving their groceries with grateful thanks. Wade accepted a bag of essentials with quiet dignity, adding them to the canvas tote he'd brought. He watched as Ellie helped younger children with their art projects, her natural kindness shining through in every interaction. Judith moved between tasks, helping where needed, but her eyes kept returning to Wade and Ellie. She seemed particularly affected whenever she overheard snippets of Ellie's cheerful chatter about her father's generosity. He gave his sandwich away the other day. Ellie told an elderly volunteer who was helping her string beads, "Even though we didn't have much bread left at home, but Daddy says when you got nothing, being kind is free." Judith turned away abruptly at these words, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. She disappeared into the storage room for several minutes, and when she emerged, her eyes were slightly red. As the morning wound down and families began to leave, Pastor Neil watched the interactions with thoughtful eyes. He observed how Judith's composed facade cracked a little more with each story she overheard about Wade's kindness, how her professional demeanor seemed to be crumbling under the weight of something that looked very much like conscience. When most of the families had gone and Ellie was helping to clean up the craft table, Pastor Neil approached Judith quietly. She was organizing donation receipts with the same precision she probably applied to bank documents, but her hands weren't quite steady. "Could I have a word?" he asked softly, gesturing toward his office. Inside the small room, with its walls lined with books and a window that looked out over the church garden, Pastor Neil closed the door gently. Judith stood near his desk, her fingers worrying the edge of her sweater, a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with her usual poise. "I know who you are, Judith Maynard," he said simply, his voice kind but firm. "Does Wade?" Judith's face paled slightly, and she shook her head, looking down at her hands. The morning light streaming through the window caught the subtle tremor in her fingers as they twisted in the soft fabric of her sweater. The morning air felt crisp and clean as Wade walked through the church's side entrance. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the worn carpet. He'd come early, before his shop opened, to properly thank Pastor Neil for the envelope of money that had helped him buy groceries over the weekend. His work boots made soft sounds against the floor as he headed toward the church office. The familiar scent of coffee and old hymnals filled the air. Before he could round the corner to Neil's office, voices drifted down the hallway, making him pause. "You need to tell him the truth, Judith." Pastor Neil's usually gentle voice carried an edge of frustration. "Wade deserves to know who you really are." "I'm trying to help him," a familiar female voice responded. Wade's heart skipped a beat as he recognized it, the woman from the park bench. If he knew I was CEO of Ridgebank. "CEO," Wade whispered, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. The word hit him like a physical blow. "These people aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet," Neil continued. "They're real families with real struggles. Wade Harper is one of the most honorable men I know." "Don't you think I see that now?" Judith Maynard's voice cracked with emotion. "That's why I've been trying to find a way to—" Wade stepped around the corner, unable to listen anymore. Both Pastor Neil and Judith fell silent at his appearance. Judith's face drained of color as their eyes met. "Wade," she breathed, taking a step toward him. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Wade's voice came out quiet but sharp. "How you pretended to be someone in need. How you sat there accepting my kindness while holding the power to destroy my business in your hands." Pastor Neil moved between them. "Wade, brother, give her a chance to—" "A chance to what?" Wade's carefully maintained composure began to crack. "To play more games? To gather more human interest stories about the little people she's crushing?" Judith's eyes filled with tears. "That's not what this was. After you shared that sandwich with me?" "Don't." Wade held up his hand. "Don't talk about that sandwich. That was real. That was genuine. This?" He gestured between them. "This was manipulation." "No." Judith stepped forward again, her voice pleading. "Everything that happened after was real too. Getting to know you and Ellie. Seeing how much you mean to this community. My daughter?" Wade's voice turned to ice. "You befriended my daughter while knowing all along you held the papers that could make her homeless." Judith flinched as if he'd struck her. "I've been trying to stop that. I've put a hold on all foreclosure proceedings." "I don't want your help," Wade cut her off. "I don't want your pity or your corporate conscience clearing. What I wanted was honesty." Pastor Neil placed a gentle hand on Wade's shoulder. "Brother, sometimes God works in unexpected ways. Don't?" Wade shrugged off the touch. "Just don't." He turned back to Judith, who stood trembling in her expensive suit that suddenly seemed so out of place in the humble church office. "Stay away from me. Stay away from my daughter. If you're going to take my shop, just do it. But don't pretend to be our friend while you do it." "Wade, please." Judith's voice broke. "What you did that day, sharing what little you had, it changed something in me. I'm trying to make things right." "Making things right starts with the truth," Wade said quietly, "and you had plenty of chances to tell it." He turned and walked away, his boots heavy on the carpet. Behind him, he could hear Pastor Neil's soft words of comfort to Judith, but he couldn't bring himself to care. The betrayal sat like a stone in his chest as he made his way to his truck. The drive to pick up Ellie from school felt longer than usual. Wade gripped the steering wheel tight, trying to push down the anger and hurt that threatened to overwhelm him. When Ellie climbed into the passenger seat, her bright smile nearly broke him. "Daddy, guess what? We finished our hope tree today. I wrote about." "That's nice, sweetheart." Wade cut her off gently. "Maybe we can talk about it later?" Ellie's smile faded as she studied his face, but she nodded and fell silent. The truck rumbled through the streets of their small town, past the shops and churches and homes that had been part of their lives forever. Wade wondered how many of them were in Ridgebank's crosshairs. Back at the church, Judith sat in one of the hard wooden chairs in Pastor Neil's office, tears flowing freely down her face. Her perfectly styled hair had come loose, and her makeup was smeared. With trembling hands, she opened her phone to check her emails, hoping for any good news to counter the weight of Wade's words. Instead, a new message from the Ridgebank board made her heart sink further. Subject: immediate resumption of foreclosure proceedings from Board of Directors Miss Fiver, Maynard. The board has reviewed your request for continued suspension of foreclosure actions and finds it without merit. All pending foreclosures are to resume immediate processing. The words blurred as fresh tears filled her eyes. She set the phone down, buried her face in her hands, and let the sobs come. The morning sunlight couldn't chase away the chill that crept through Wade's bones as he stared at the crisp white envelope in his hands. His calloused fingers trembled slightly as he opened it, though he already knew what was inside. The Ridgebank letterhead seemed to mock him with its polished, professional appearance. Foreclosure action resumed, the bold letters declared at the top of the page. Wade's shoulders slumped as he read through the legal jargon, each word another weight pressing down on him. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, the worn linoleum floor and dated cabinets, a stark reminder of all he hadn't been able to fix or improve over the years. "Daddy?" Ellie's voice came from the doorway, still fuzzy with sleep. She wore her favorite pajamas, the ones with little cartoon cats that were getting too short at the ankles. "Is that another bank letter?" Wade quickly folded the paper and tried to smile, but his daughter knew him too well. She'd inherited her mother's ability to read right through his brave faces. "Come here, sweetheart," he said softly, pulling out a kitchen chair. "We need to talk about something important." Across town, in Ridgebank's gleaming corporate headquarters, Judith Maynard stood her ground before the board of directors. The mahogany conference table stretched between them like a barrier, and the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the plush carpet. "These foreclosures are destroying communities," Judith argued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We have an opportunity to create sustainable payment plans that benefit both the bank and our customers." "Miss Maynard," Chairman Roberts interrupted, his silver hair catching the light as he leaned forward, "your recent behavior has been concerning. This isn't a charity organization." "No," Judith agreed, straightening her spine. "It's a community bank. The word community used to mean something here." She pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. "I've prepared a detailed analysis showing how modified loan structures could actually increase our long-term profits while building customer loyalty." Back in the Harper kitchen, Ellie sat very still as Wade explained their situation in the gentlest terms he could manage. Her small hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her dark eyes wide with understanding beyond her years. "So we might have to move?" she asked quietly. "Away from here?" Wade nodded slowly, his heart breaking at the tremor in her voice. "Yes, honey, we might have to find somewhere else to live." "But what about my school?" Ellie's lower lip quivered slightly. "What about Miss Thompson's class in the Hope Tree Project? And Jenny and Sarah?" Wade couldn't answer. The words stuck in his throat like thorns. Instead, he reached across the table and covered her small hands with his larger one, trying to convey comfort through touch when words failed him. In the Ridgebank boardroom, Judith stood her ground as the directors exchanged glances. Chairman Roberts drummed his fingers on the polished table surface, his expression calculating. "You're willing to stake your career on this?" "Experiment in compassion?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I am," Judith replied without hesitation. "If I can't prove that modified payment plans and community investment are profitable within 2 weeks, I'll tender my resignation," the board members murmured among themselves. Finally, Roberts nodded curtly. 2 weeks, Miss Maynard. But understand this, chap. If you fail, we'll not. Only accept your resignation. We'll accelerate all pending foreclosures." Judith felt her stomach clench, but kept her expression neutral. "Understood, sir." The day dragged on, heavy with worry and uncertainty. Wade worked in his garage, trying to focus on the few repairs he had scheduled, but his mind kept drifting to practical concerns. Where would they live? How would he find work in a new town? How could he keep Ellie in a stable school? Evening came too quickly, bringing with it the familiar routine of dinner preparation. Wade heated up a can of soup and made grilled cheese sandwiches, the simple meal stretching their dwindling groceries another day. Ellie was quieter than usual as they ate, pushing her soup around with her spoon. Then, without warning, she slid off her chair and ran to her room. Wade heard paper rustling, followed by the soft pat of her feet as she returned. "I made this for you today," she said, holding out a piece of paper. Wade carefully wiped his hands and took the drawing. His vision blurred as he looked at it, their garage rendered in careful crayon strokes, surrounded by red and pink hearts. Ellie had drawn their old pickup truck out front, and two stick figures holding hands, one tall, one small. At the top, in her best handwriting, she'd written, "Harper and Daughter Auto Shop." "We just need hope, right, Daddy?" Ellie asked softly, echoing the message from her school's Hope Tree project. Wade nodded, unable to speak as tears welled in his eyes. He pulled Ellie into a tight hug, pressing a kiss to the top of her head as she wrapped her small arms around his neck. The drawing trembled slightly in his hand, but he held it carefully, knowing he would treasure it always, no matter what the future held. The kitchen table wobbled as Ellie carefully wrote out her sign in big, colorful letters. Her tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, rainbow markers scattered around her like fallen leaves. Wade watched from the doorway, his heart aching at her determination. "How do you spell business, Daddy?" Ellie asked, looking up with those earnest brown eyes. "Business." Wade spelled out slowly, walking over to peek at her work. The sign read, "Ellie's Lemonade Stand, Save Daddy's Garage," with little hearts and wrenches drawn in the corners. "Is it okay if we set up outside the shop?" Her voice was small but hopeful. "Maybe some of your customers will want lemonade while they wait." Wade knelt beside her chair, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, you don't have to do this. The garage, it's not your problem to fix. But we're a team, right?" Ellie's chin lifted stubbornly. "You always say helping others makes everything better, so now it's my turn to help." Wade couldn't argue with that logic. Together, they gathered supplies from their modest kitchen, a pitcher, paper cups from their church's last potluck, and the ingredients for lemonade. Wade contributed the last of their sugar, watching as Ellie carefully measured and stirred. The morning air was crisp as they set up a card table outside Harper Automotive. Wade positioned it where passing cars could easily see Ellie's bright sign. She arranged everything just so: pitcher in the center, cups in neat stacks, and a mason jar labeled "Thank You" for money. "Perfect," Ellie declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. She wore her favorite yellow dress, the one that matched her sunny spirit. The first hour was quiet. Wade worked on Mrs. Johnson's old Buick while keeping an eye on Ellie through the garage door. She waved at every passing car with unwavering enthusiasm. Then old Mr. Peterson from the hardware store shuffled over. "Well, what do we have here? Would you like some lemonade, Mr. Peterson?" Ellie's face lit up. "It's fresh squeezed." "Fresh squeezed, you say?" He pulled out his wallet. "How much?" $1, please. But you can give more if you want to help save Daddy's garage." Mr. Peterson looked at Wade, then back at Ellie. Without a word, he placed a $20 bill in the jar. "Keep the change, sweetheart. Best lemonade in town." Word spread quickly in their small community. Soon, a steady stream of familiar faces appeared. Teachers from Ellie's school, regulars from church, neighbors they'd helped over the years. Each one had a kind word and a contribution. Mrs. Martinez from the bakery brought fresh cookies to go with the lemonade. "On the house," she insisted, patting Ellie's cheek. "Your father fixed my delivery van last month and wouldn't take extra for working late." By noon, Sarah Chin from the local newspaper showed up with her camera. "Mind if I take a few pictures?" she asked. "We could use a heartwarming story about community spirit." Ellie posed proudly beside her stand while Sarah snapped photos. "Can you tell me why you started this?" Sarah asked, notebook in hand. "Because everyone needs help sometimes," Ellie answered simply. "And Daddy always helps others, so now it's his turn." Wade had to turn away, pretending to check something under the Buick's hood as his eyes grew misty. Throughout the afternoon, more people came. Some Wade recognized, others were strangers who'd heard about the stand. One well-dressed woman lingered at the edge of the crowd. She slipped a $50 bill into the jar when no one was looking, but Wade caught a glimpse of Judith's face before she hurried away. The sun was setting when Wade finally convinced Ellie to pack up. She carefully counted out the day's earnings at the kitchen table while Wade made dinner, their last box of mac and cheese with some frozen peas mixed in. $237, Ellie announced proudly, arranging the bills in neat stacks. "That's a lot, right?" Wade sat down beside her, pulling her into a tight hug. It wasn't nearly enough to save the garage, but the day had given him something more valuable than money: hope. The knowledge that they weren't alone, that their community cared, felt like a warm blanket around his shoulders. "It's wonderful, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You did something amazing today." "Can we do it again tomorrow?" Ellie asked through a yawn. Wade smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Maybe there's still time," he said softly. And for the first time in weeks, He actually believed it might be true. They ate their simple dinner together, the kitchen quiet except for the scrape of forks against bowls. But it was a peaceful, quiet, filled with the lingering warmth of the day's events and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest gestures could spark the biggest changes. Judith sat at her favorite corner cafe, away from the polished marble and mahogany of Ridgebank's offices. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the morning air as she arranged her papers on the weathered wooden table. Across from her, Martin Chin, owner of the local hardware store, stirred his tea with careful precision. Next to him, Sarah Thompson, who ran the town's only bookshop, nervously tapped her fingers against her cup. A community co-op? Martin's eyebrows rose skeptically. Sounds like a fancy way of saying we all go down together instead of one at a time. Judith leaned forward, her usually pristine blazer slightly wrinkled from hours of work. It's more than that. Think of it as strength in numbers. When businesses support each other, the whole community thrives. Tom Wheeler, a retired banker with silver hair and kind eyes, cleared his throat. I've seen similar models work in other towns, but it takes commitment, real commitment. Sarah stopped tapping and sat up straighter. How would it actually work? In real terms? Judith pulled out a diagram she'd sketched. Her hands trembled slightly. This mattered more than any board presentation she'd ever given. Each business becomes a member owner. You pool resources, share costs, and most importantly, guarantee each other's loans. That's the scary part right there, Martin said, pointing at the word guarantee with his spoon. If one fails, then we all help prevent that failure, Judith interrupted gently. When Wade's garage struggles, maybe your hardware store offers materials at cost. When Sarah's bookshop has a slow month, we organize community events there. Tom nodded slowly, his banker's mind calculating. The risk is spread out, but so are the rewards. It's not just about surviving, it's about growing together. Exactly, Judith said, warming to his understanding. And Ridgebank would offer preferential rates to co-op members, lower than anything you could get individually. Sarah's eyes widened. Your board would agree to that? Judith gathered her papers, straightening them with determined movements. That's my next battle, but first, I needed to know if you would consider it. The three exchanged glances. Martin spoke first, his initial skepticism softening. If, and that's a big if, you can get the bank to agree, I'm willing to learn more. Count me in too, Sarah added quietly. We've all seen too many going out of business signs lately. Tom pulled out a pen and started making notes on a napkin. The structure would need careful planning, monthly meetings, clear bylaws, transparent accounting. Judith felt hope flutter in her chest as they began discussing details. This was just the beginning, but it was a start. 3 hours later, she stood in Ridgebank's executive conference room, facing the board. The familiar smell of leather chairs and wood polish now felt suffocating. 8 pairs of eyes stared back at her, most hostile, a few merely bored. A pilot program? Richard Maxwell, the board chairman, repeated her words with thinly veiled disdain. Miss Maynard, we're a bank, not a social experiment. Judith stepped closer to the projection screen, showing her presentation. It's sound business strategy. When communities thrive, banks profit. Our foreclosure rates are destroying long-term value. Our foreclosure rates are protecting shareholder interests, Patricia Wells countered from her seat near the chairman. Are they? Judith clicked to her next slide. Look at these numbers. Every foreclosure triggers a ripple effect. Property values drop. Other businesses struggle. Tax revenues fall. We're creating the very conditions that lead to more defaults. The youngest board member, David Torres, leaned forward. The co-op model is interesting, but risky. How do we ensure compliance? 2 weeks, Judith said firmly. Give me 2 weeks to prove it can work. One town, one pilot program. If it fails, I'll resign. A murmur ran through the room. Maxwell's eyes narrowed. You'd stake your career on this? Yes. Judith's voice didn't waver. Because I believe it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. The board members exchanged glances. Maxwell spoke after a long pause. 2 weeks, one town. You'll provide daily updates and full transparency of all transactions. Agreed. Judith gathered her materials, her hands steady despite her racing heart. And Judith, Maxwell called as she reached the door. When this fails, and it will, your resignation letter should be on my desk the same day. She nodded once and left the room. In her office, she immediately began pulling files, her computer screen filling with spreadsheets and legal documents. The co-op would need bylaws, membership agreements, loan structures. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she worked. A photo caught her eye, the newspaper clipping of Ellie's lemonade stand. The little girl's determined smile, Wade's weathered hands helping her arrange cups. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about people. Judith opened a new document and typed Harper Automotive Refinancing Proposal at the top. If the co-op was going to work, she needed a success story, and she knew exactly where to start. She reached for her phone to call Tom Wheeler. They had 2 weeks to prove that Compassion could be profitable. 2 weeks to save not just Wade's garage, but maybe the whole town. As she dialed, Judith glanced again at the newspaper photo. The words Wade had spoken to her that first day in the park echoed in her mind. When you got nothing, kindness is the only thing you can afford. She was about to prove that kindness, properly structured, could afford quite a lot. The church basement buzzed with warmth and chatter as families gathered for the Friday night spaghetti dinner. Paper plates clinked against plastic utensils, and the rich aroma of tomato sauce and garlic bread filled the air. Children darted between folding tables draped with red checkered cloths while parents chatted in small groups. Wade Harper stood in line with Ellie, his weathered hands holding 2 plain white plates. His daughter bounced on her toes, her small fingers wrapped around the piece of paper she'd brought from school. The Hope Tree message felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. "Daddy, when can I read mine?" Ellie whispered, tugging at his worn flannel shirt. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation. "After dinner, sweetheart," Wade replied softly. "Pastor Neil said all the kids will get their turn." Mrs. Peterson, one of the church volunteers, smiled warmly as she ladled generous portions of spaghetti onto their plates. "Extra meatballs for you both," she said with a wink. "Growing girls need their protein." Wade nodded gratefully, knowing the extra food wasn't by chance. The whole church had been quietly looking out for them since Sarah passed away. They found seats at a table near the front, joining the Martinez family. Their son Miguel was in Ellie's class, and the 2 children immediately launched into an animated discussion about their Hope Tree messages. At the back of the room, partially hidden behind a support column, Judith Maynard sat alone. She'd slipped in quietly, wearing casual clothes, instead of her usual business attire. Her heart ached watching Wade and Ellie together, seeing the gentle way he made sure his daughter had everything she needed before taking a bite himself. Pastor Neil moved through the room, stopping at each table to chat and laugh with his congregation. When he reached Wade's table, he placed a gentle hand on Ellie's shoulder. "Are you ready to share your message with everyone tonight?" Ellie nodded enthusiastically, her brown curls bouncing. "I practiced it 3 times. After the plates were cleared and the dessert table had been thoroughly raided by the children, Pastor Neil stood at the small podium. "Friends, as you know, our elementary school has been working on something special called the Hope Tree. Tonight, we're blessed to have some of our young people share their messages of hope with us." One by one, children stood and read their messages. Some spoke of friends sharing lunch, others of helping with homework or being kind to new students. Each story brought smiles and gentle applause. When it was Ellie's turn, she walked to the front with determination in every step. Her small fingers smoothed out her paper, and she took a deep breath. "My Hope Tree message is about my daddy," she began, her voice clear and strong. "My daddy gave his only sandwich away." The room fell silent. Wade felt his chest tighten as Ellie continued. "We didn't have much food that morning, but Daddy shared anyway. He didn't know I saw him in the park, but I did. He gave his half of our sandwich to someone who was hungry." Ellie's eyes found her father's. "That's what hope looks like to me." Several women wiped tears from their eyes. Mr. Johnson, the hardware store owner, cleared his throat gruffly. Wade sat very still, his own eyes glistening. Pastor Neil stepped forward, placing his arm around Ellie's shoulders. "Thank you, Ellie. Your daddy teaches us all about generosity." He paused, looking around the room. "Friends, I've been praying about our community, about Wade and others who are struggling. What if we organized a festival, a real town gathering to raise funds for our neighbors in need?" Excited murmurs filled the room. Mrs. Peterson immediately volunteered her famous pies. The Martinez family offered to coordinate games and entertainment. "I've already received word," Pastor Neil announced, holding up an envelope, "of an anonymous donation of $5,000 to get us started." Gasps and applause erupted. Wade's head snapped up in surprise. In the back of the room, Judith sat very still, her heart racing. She'd arranged the donation through a shell company name, making sure it couldn't be traced back to her or the bank. "God works in mysterious ways," Pastor Neil continued, his eyes scanning the room knowingly. "Sometimes hope comes from unexpected places. The meeting evolved into an impromptu planning session. People clustered together, offering what they could: time, talents, resources. Wade sat quietly, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Ellie climbed onto his lap, something she hadn't done in public for months, claiming she was too big now. She wrapped her arms around his neck. "Are you okay, Daddy?" Wade hugged her close. "I'm more than okay, sweetheart." As the evening wound down, Wade and Ellie walked home under a sky full of stars. The spring air was crisp, but Wade felt warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders weren't heavy with worry. "Look," Ellie pointed excitedly. "You're smiling, Daddy, just like Mommy would want." Wade's smile grew wider as he squeezed his daughter's hand. She was right. Sarah would have loved this evening, would have been the first to volunteer for the festival. She had always believed in the goodness of people, just like their daughter did. The morning sun peeked through scattered clouds as a small army of volunteers gathered outside Harper Automotive. Pastor Neil stood at the front, clipboard in hand, organizing teams for different tasks. The worn building seemed to hold its breath, waiting for transformation. "All right, folks," Pastor Neil called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "Let's show Wade what community really means." Wade stood in the doorway of his garage, overwhelmed by the sight. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop was already pulling weeds from the cracked concrete. Tom Baker, who ran the local hardware store, unloaded boxes of supplies from his pickup truck. Even Mr. Johnson, who hadn't left his house much since his wife passed, showed up with paint rollers and brushes. "Daddy, look!" Ellie tugged at Wade's sleeve, pointing to a group of her classmates. They wore matching hand-decorated t-shirts that read, "Hope Helpers." "Can I go paint with them?" Wade squeezed her shoulder. "Of course, sweetheart. Just be careful with the paint." Inside the garage, the transformation was already underway. The old heater that had given out weeks ago sat dismantled, with two local handymen examining its parts. Wade approached them, curious about their work. "Don't you worry about this, Wade," said Mike, wiping grease from his hands. "Someone already paid for the replacement parts. Top quality stuff, too." Wade's eyebrows shot up. "Paid for? Who?" Mike shrugged. "Tom at the hardware store just said it was taken care of. Anonymous donor, I guess." Throughout the morning, more mysterious deliveries arrived. New tools appeared on workbenches. Fresh supplies filled empty shelves. Every time Wade asked about payment, he received the same answer: "It's been handled." Outside, Ellie and her friends worked on their special project. They'd set up an old stepladder and spread newspapers on the ground. With careful concentration, they painted a large piece of plywood. Ellie's artistic touch was evident in the flowing letters that spelled out "Hope Garage" in bright blues and yellows. "What do you think, Daddy?" Ellie called out, paint smudged on her cheek. Wade walked over and studied their work. The letters weren't perfect, but they carried something more valuable: heart. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Just beautiful." By early afternoon, the garage had undergone a remarkable transformation. The broken windows were replaced with clear glass that let in streams of natural light. The walls gleamed with fresh paint, and the floor had been thoroughly cleaned and sealed. Even the old workbench, which had wobbled for years, stood steady on new legs. Mrs. Peterson from the diner arrived with sandwiches and lemonade for everyone. As the volunteers gathered to eat, Wade noticed Tom Baker approaching with an envelope. "Here's all the receipts for the supplies," Tom said, handing it over. "Everything's paid in full." Wade hesitated before taking the envelope. "Tom, I can't accept." "You're not accepting anything from me," Tom interrupted with a knowing smile. "Sometimes blessings just come our way, Wade. Best thing to do is receive them with grace." Across the street, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, Judith watched the scene unfold. She wore casual clothes instead of her usual business attire, trying to blend in with the neighborhood. Her heart swelled watching the community come together, even as guilt gnawed at her conscience for having to hide. Her phone buzzed. It was Sandra, her assistant at Ridgebank. "Miss Maynard." Sandra's voice was tense. "The board is asking questions about the recent transactions in Wadestown. They're particularly interested in the hardware store payments." Judith stepped further behind the tree, lowering her voice. "What exactly are they asking?" "They want to know why you're personally involving yourself in a foreclosure case. Mr. Richardson specifically mentioned unauthorized involvement." Judith watched as Ellie climbed down from the stepladder, proudly showing her paint-stained hands to her father. Wade's laugh carried across the street, the first real laugh she'd heard from him. Tell them I'm conducting a thorough investigation of our small business loan practices, Judith replied firmly. It's within my authority as CEO to review any case personally. They're not buying it, Sandra warned. They're scheduling an emergency board meeting for next week. Inside the garage, Wade walked through the space in amazement. The old calendar that had hung crooked for months was now straight, marking days that suddenly felt full of possibility instead of dread. The tools were organized, the workspace clean, and most importantly, the heating system hummed steadily. Ellie and her friends were putting the finishing touches on their sign. They had added small hearts and stars around the letters, making it uniquely theirs. Wade watched as they collaborated, passing brushes back and forth, encouraging each other with gentle words. The sign's almost ready, Ellie announced excitedly. Can we hang it up now? Wade gathered some volunteers. Together, they carefully mounted the sign above the garage door. The fresh paint glistened in the afternoon sun, sending a clear message to anyone who passed by. This wasn't just a garage anymore. It was a symbol of hope. From her hidden spot, Judith felt tears welling up in her eyes. This was what banking should be about, not just numbers on a spreadsheet, but people helping people, communities coming together, dreams being rebuilt. Her phone buzzed again with another message from Sandra. Board members are reviewing all recent transactions. They're asking about the shell company used for the church donation. What should I tell them? Judith watched as Wade stood back to admire the new sign, his arm around Ellie's shoulders. The father and daughter looked at their restored garage with matching expressions of wonder and gratitude. In that moment, Judith knew the risk to her career was worth it. Tell them I'll address all their concerns at the board meeting, she texted back, then turned off her phone. The afternoon wound down as volunteers began gathering their tools and cleaning up. Wade tried to thank each person individually, but many just smiled and hurried away, avoiding his gratitude as if it might break some unspoken spell. Looking at his transformed garage, Wade shook his head in disbelief. I don't understand, he muttered to himself. Who would do all this? Ellie, overhearing him, took his hand. Maybe it's like you always say, Daddy, when you give away kindness, it comes back to you. Wade squeezed her hand, remembering a shared sandwich on a cold morning that felt like a lifetime ago. He didn't know who was behind all this generosity, but he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. The late afternoon sun painted the entire town square in warm, honeyed hues as the first notes of music drifted through the crisp autumn air. Local band The Ridge Runners had set up their instruments on a makeshift stage, constructed from borrowed lumber and plywood, their weathered sound system, courtesy of the high school auditorium. The lead guitarist's fingers danced across the strings, pulling out cheerful country melodies that seemed to lift the spirits of everyone within earshot. The festival had transformed the usually quiet square into a bustling carnival of community spirit. The rich aroma of grilled hamburgers sizzled on portable grills, while the sweet scent of fresh popcorn mingled with the cotton candy machine's sugary perfume. Mrs. Henderson from the Methodist Church had set up a baking station, and the smell of her famous chocolate chip cookies competed with the savory barbecue smoke for attention. Everywhere Wade looked, neighbors had turned out with folding tables, handmade signs, and generous hearts. Wade Harper stood at his automotive diagnostic station, nothing more than a simple folding table positioned strategically outside his garage bay. His weathered, oil-stained hands moved with the practiced ease of 2 decades as he checked the dipstick in Mrs. Peterson's aging Buick. The car had seen better days, its faded blue paint telling stories of countless miles and faithful service. He wiped the metal clean and slid it back into place with a soft click. Looks like you're due for a change in about 500 miles, he said, offering Mrs. Peterson one of his gentle, reassuring smiles. But she's running just fine otherwise. This old girl's got plenty of life left in her. Mrs. Peterson's eyes crinkled at the corners as she beamed back at him. Oh, Wade, she said, pressing a crisp $20 bill into the clear donation jar that already contained a growing collection of bills and coins. You've kept this old beauty running for 10 whole years now, through thick and thin. Lord knows what I would have done without you. We simply cannot lose you in that garage of yours. The sincerity in her voice made Wade's chest tighten with emotion he tried to keep hidden. Across the square, Ellie darted between the festival booths like a bright butterfly, her face absolutely glowing with pure excitement. She wore a special Save Harper automotive t-shirt that Sarah from the diner had specially made for her using fabric markers and iron-on letters. The shirt hung loose on her small frame, a size too big, but she wore it with the pride of a knight donning armor. It made her feel important, like she was part of something much bigger than herself, something that mattered. Daddy, Daddy! she called out breathlessly, her sneakers slapping against the pavement as she ran toward Wade. Her small fist clutched a colorful handful of raffle tickets like precious treasures. Mr. Johnson from the bank said, "We've already raised over $2,000, and the festival's only been going for 2 hours." Wade wiped his hands methodically on a clean shop rag, his throat suddenly tight with overwhelming emotion. The number seemed impossible, almost too good to believe. That's wonderful, sweetheart," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't bring himself to say more without his voice breaking completely. The festival had sprawled organically across 3 full blocks of Main Street, with local businesses and residents setting up colorful booths and creative activities wherever space allowed. The hardware store had organized a nail-driving contest that drew cheers from spectators as participants tried to drive a nail with the fewest hammer strikes. The town library had arranged a massive book sale, with paperback novels and children's stories spread across several folding tables. Even old Mr. Turner, who rarely ventured from his house anymore, except for doctor appointments, had surprised everyone by setting up a small table selling mason jars of his legendary homemade pickles. Pastor Neil worked through the growing crowd with his characteristic energy, his booming voice carrying easily over the background music as he announced raffle prizes and publicly thanked every donor by name. Children weaved between adults' legs, their faces transformed into butterflies, tigers, and superheroes, thanks to the talented volunteers from the high school art club who had donated their time and supplies. "Hey there, Star Mechanic," Sarah called out from her bustling food booth, her voice full of cheerful pride. Steam rose from her grill as she flipped another batch of hamburgers. "These Harper's Hope burgers are selling like hotcakes." She created the special recipe just for the fundraiser, complete with her secret sauce and an extra layer of melted cheese, naming it after Wade's garage with the kind of thoughtfulness that made small towns special. Wade stood in the midst of it all, watching with quiet amazement that bordered on disbelief. These were his neighbors, people whose cars he'd serviced, whose doors he'd unstuck during winter freezes, whose batteries he'd jumped on cold Monday mornings, folks whose vehicles he'd kept running when their budgets were stretched thin, never once demanding payment he knew they couldn't afford. Now they'd all shown up, every single one of them, giving back in their own unique ways. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, volunteers strung up twinkling lights overhead, creating a magical canopy that stretched across the entire square. The warm glow cast everything in a fairy tale light that made the evening feel almost sacred. Wade had just finished examining the transmission fluid on another neighbor's pickup truck when he noticed a familiar figure standing somewhat uncertainly near the edge of the crowd. Judith Maynard had traded her usual crisp business attire for casual clothes, well-fitted jeans, and a simple cream-colored blouse that made her look more approachable, more human. She maintained a respectful distance from Wade, clearly honoring his earlier request for space, but her eyes kept drifting toward the activity around his booth. Instead of approaching him directly, she made her way carefully through the crowd toward the children's craft table where Ellie sat. Wade watched from his position across the square as Judith knelt gracefully beside his daughter. Even from that distance, he could see the genuine gentleness in her posture, the way she lowered herself to Ellie's eye level. She reached into her pocket and withdrew something small that caught the string lights and sparkled briefly in her palm. Ellie's dark eyes widened with wonder as Judith carefully fastened what appeared to be a delicate charm bracelet around her small wrist. The little girl lifted her arm to examine the gift more closely, turning her hand this way and that to catch the light. Then, in a moment of pure spontaneity that only children possess, she threw her thin arms around Judith's neck in an impulsive, heartfelt hug. For just an instant, Judith's carefully composed facade cracked open like an eggshell, revealing the raw emotion she kept hidden underneath her professional demeanor. Her shoulders trembled slightly as she whispered something close to Ellie's ear, squeezed the child's hand with tender care, and then quickly disappeared back into the crowd before anyone could see the tears that had gathered in her eyes. Later in the evening, when the initial excitement had settled into a comfortable buzz of conversation and laughter, Ellie skipped over to show Wade the bracelet. Up close, he could see it wasn't expensive or flashy, nothing meant to impress with its cost. Instead, it was a simple silver chain, adorned with 3 meaningful charms: a 5-pointed star, a tiny heart, and what looked like a miniature wrench no bigger than his thumbnail. She said it was for courage? Ellie explained seriously, her voice full of the wisdom that children sometimes possess. Because brave girls need special jewelry sometimes. Isn't that right, Daddy? Wade nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. The festival continued. Well into the evening, taking on an almost magical quality as darkness settled over the square. The donation jar filled to overflowing and was emptied into the secure lockbox in Pastor Neil's office, only to fill up again within the hour. People Wade barely knew faces he recognized, but names he struggled to remember came up to shake his calloused hand or share stories about times he'd helped them out of difficult situations. Mrs. Wilson, her gray hair perfectly curled despite the evening breeze, remembered with vivid detail how he'd fixed her ancient sedan at nearly midnight when she desperately needed to rush her beloved cat to the emergency veterinary clinic. Tom from the grocery store, his apron still bearing traces of the day's work, talked animatedly about the rainy afternoon when Wade had patiently taught his awkward teenage son how to change a flat tire in a puddle-filled parking lot. Each memory came attached to a monetary contribution, each shared story bound up with genuine hope for Wade's future. As the crowd gradually began to thin and the Ridge Runners shifted to softer, more contemplative melodies, Wade found himself standing at the very edge of the town square. The stars had emerged in the clear night sky, their ancient light twinkling alongside the modern string lights that still glowed overhead. The cool autumn air carried the lingering scents of the evening barbecue smoke, sweet cotton candy, and the crisp promise of the changing season. Ellie leaned heavily against his side, her small body warm and relaxed with exhaustion but radiating contentment. Her new bracelet caught the light and jingled softly whenever she moved her arm. Wade wrapped his strong arm around her shoulders and pulled her even closer, breathing in the sweet scent of cotton candy that clung to her dark hair like a sugary perfume. The night air was cool against his face, but his heart felt warmer than it had in months. Looking up at the vast expanse of stars, stretching endlessly above them, he whispered quiet words of gratitude to whoever might be listening. Then he looked down at his precious daughter, this little person who had become his whole world, and felt something shift inside his chest, something that felt remarkably like hope. "Maybe we're gonna make it after all, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the distant music and the gentle murmur of the remaining crowd. The morning dawned gray and cold, a stark contrast to yesterday's festive warmth. In her corner office at Ridgebank's headquarters, Judith sat at her mahogany desk, her hands trembling as she read the notice that had just been delivered. The words blurred before her eyes, but their meaning was crystal clear. Effective immediately, she was removed from her position as CEO. Her secretary knocked softly before entering. "Miss Maynard, the board members are waiting in the conference room." Judith straightened her spine and smoothed her blazer. The walk to the conference room felt like a march to execution. Inside, 7 stern faces greeted her with cold stares. "Miss Maynard," Chairman Roberts began, his voice clipped, "your recent actions have demonstrated a concerning departure from Ridgebank's core values and objectives." Judith's throat tightened. "Our core values should include compassion. Our core values," Roberts cut in, "are to protect our shareholders' interests. Your unauthorized pilot program and personal involvement in these small-town matters have put the bank at risk." Another board member slid a thick folder across the table. "All changes implemented under your recent initiatives are being reversed. The community co-op program is dissolved, effective immediately. Standard foreclosure proceedings will resume today." Judith's heart dropped. "You can't do this. These are people's lives." "We can, and we have," Roberts stated firmly. "Security will escort you to clear out your office." Walking back to her office, Judith's heels clicked against the marble floors with desperate urgency. She gathered her personal belongings with shaking hands, her mind racing to Wade and Ellie. Her last check as CEO lay on her desk, a substantial sum that now felt hollow. She practically ran to her car, her designer purse clutched tight against her chest. The drive to Wade's garage seemed endless. Traffic lights turned red at every intersection, each second ticking away like a countdown to disaster. But she was too late. When she pulled up to Harper Automotive, her worst fears materialized before her eyes. A bank officer in a crisp suit stood on a stepladder, methodically hammering nails into boards across the garage doors. The sound echoed like gunshots in the quiet morning air. Ellie sat on the curb, her small shoulders shaking with sobs. The charm bracelet Judith had given her glinted in the weak sunlight as she clutched it close to her chest. Her school bag lay forgotten beside her, its cheerful butterfly pattern, mockery of the dark moment. Wade stood a few feet away, as still as a statue. His usual warm eyes were distant, fixed on the garage that had been his life's work. His father's tools, his own dreams, and his daughter's future, all being sealed away behind those wooden boards. His weathered hands hung limply at his sides, no longer able to fix what was broken. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered, their faces a mixture of shock and helpless anger. Pastor Neil stood among them, one hand on his collar, lips moving in silent prayer. Judith stepped out of her car on unsteady legs. The click of her heels on the pavement seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. She walked toward Wade, her designer suit feeling like armor that had failed to protect anyone. The bank officer paused in his work, recognizing her. "Miss Maynard, I was told you no longer have authority here." "I know," she said softly, not taking her eyes off Wade. Ellie looked up at the sound of Judith's voice, her tear-stained face a portrait of betrayal and confusion. "You said you'd help us," she whispered. The words cut deeper than any board meeting ever could. Judith knelt beside Ellie, not caring about the dirt on her expensive skirt. "I tried, sweetheart. I tried so hard." Wade finally turned to look at her, his face a mask of quiet dignity even in defeat. Judith stood and reached into her purse, pulling out the envelope containing her final check. Her hand shook as she held it out to him. "I tried," she repeated, tears spilling down her cheeks. The makeup she'd applied so carefully that morning left dark tracks on her face. "I tried to change things. I thought I had more time." Wade didn't reach for the envelope. He just looked at her with those deep, tired eyes that had once shared half a sandwich with a stranger. Judith placed the envelope on top of Ellie's school bag. She opened her mouth to say more, but what could words possibly fix now? The sound of hammering resumed behind them, each blow marking another nail in the coffin of Wade's dreams. She turned and walked away, her tears falling freely now. Behind her, she could hear Ellie's renewed sobs and the murmurs of the gathered townspeople. But it was the silence from Wade that hurt the most, the same silence that had greeted her when she'd first sat beside him on that park bench. Only now it held no warmth, no possibility, no hope. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the street. Judith's shadow stretched out behind her as she walked away, a dark reminder of all she'd failed to accomplish. She'd tried to be a bridge between two worlds, but in the end, she'd only managed to fall between them. The evening settled heavily over Wade's small house like a thick blanket, bringing with it a silence that felt almost physical, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest and makes every breath deliberate. He sat in his threadbare armchair, the one with the sagging cushion that had molded itself to his body over countless nights of worry. The darkness of the living room was broken only by the dim, amber glow of a street lamp filtering through thin curtains that had seen better days, casting long shadows that seemed to reach into every corner. The room still held traces of yesterday's hope, scattered like forgotten dreams. Ellie's Hope Garage banner lay crumpled in the corner where he'd dropped it after taking it down, the bright yellow letters now wrinkled and faded. Her hand-painted lemonade stand sign rested against the wall, propped there as if waiting for better days to return. The coffee table bore rings from glasses of lemonade they'd shared just hours before, when the world still seemed full of possibilities. Wade stared at his calloused hands, turning them over as if they might hold answers he couldn't find anywhere else. These hands had built engines, held his daughter when she cried, signed the papers that sealed his garages. Fate. Now they felt empty, purposeless. "Ellie, sweetheart," Wade's voice came out rougher than he intended, scraping against his throat like sandpaper. He cleared his throat and tried again, softer this time. "Can you come here for a minute?" The soft padding of her feet on the worn carpet preceded her appearance, each footstep a small comfort in the heavy silence. She wore her favorite pajamas, the ones with tiny stars scattered across navy blue fabric, the same pajamas her mother had bought her last Christmas, now a bit too short at the ankles, where she'd grown taller this past year. Her blonde hair was mussed from lying on her pillow, and her face, usually bright with endless optimism that could light up the darkest room, now carried shadows of worry that no 10-year-old should ever know. "Yes, Daddy?" She settled cross-legged on the floor near his feet, looking up at him with those green eyes that reminded him so much of her mother eyes that held trust and love and a wisdom that sometimes caught him off guard. Wade leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and clasping his hands together. The weight of what he had to tell her pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. "I need to talk to you about something important." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't frighten her, that wouldn't steal away what remained of her childhood innocence. "You know the factory across town, the big one where Mr. Johnson's dad works?" Ellie nodded slowly, her small brow furrowing with concentration. "The big gray building with all the loud machines? The one that makes the sky look smoky sometimes?" "That's the one." Wade forced a small smile that felt like it might crack his face. Well, they're looking for night shift workers, and I'm thinking about taking a job there, just temporarily, until we get back on our feet. The silence that followed felt endless, stretching between them like a chasm. Ellie's small fingers played with the charm bracelet. Judith had given her the silver one with the tiny car charm that caught the streetlight and threw small rainbows on the wall. She turned it round and round her wrist, a nervous habit she developed whenever she was thinking hard about something difficult. But she started, then stopped, biting her lower lip the way she did when she was trying to be brave. But what about sleeping? And who will walk me to school? And what if I have nightmares? Wade's heart clenched like a fist in his chest. Every question was a small knife, cutting into the careful reasons he'd built up for why this would work. I'd work at night, when you're supposed to be sleeping. Mrs. Peterson next door, you remember her, with the garden full of sunflowers? She said she'd help get you to school in the mornings, and I'd be home in time to pick you up in the afternoon, just like always. I can stay by myself at night, Ellie said quickly, her voice carrying a brave tremor that made her sound older than her years. I'm not scared of the dark anymore. Really, I'm not. But Wade saw the fear flickering in her eyes like candlelight in the wind. He saw how her fingers tightened around the bracelet until her knuckles went white. He remembered all too clearly the nights after her mother passed, how she'd wake up crying and calling his name, needing to make sure he was still there, still real, still hers. Come here, he whispered, opening his arms wide. She climbed into his lap without hesitation, something she hadn't done in months, claiming she was too old for such things now. But tonight, she needed to be small again, to be held and protected from a world that suddenly felt too big and too scary. He held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and the detergent he used on her pajamas. Her head fit perfectly under his chin, the way it had when she was tiny. It won't be forever, Princess, just until we figure things out, just until something better comes along. Promise? Her voice was muffled against his chest, small and uncertain. I promise, he said, though the words felt heavy on his tongue. The next night came too quickly, arriving like an unwelcome guest at the door. Wade stood in the factory's sterile break room, pulling on the scratchy gray uniform with TEMP printed in bold black letters across the back, a label that felt like a brand, marking him as temporary, disposable, not quite belonging. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with an electric buzz that seemed to get under his skin, casting harsh shadows on everything and everyone. The room smelled of industrial soap and stale coffee, nothing like the familiar scents of motor oil and metal that had defined his working life. The night shift supervisor, a weathered man named Carl with tired eyes and nicotine-stained fingers, gave him a 5-minute orientation that felt more like a warning. Keep the line moving, check for jams, mark any defects with this red pen, don't overthink it. Simple enough for anyone with a working brain. Simple, maybe, but soul-crushing. Wade stood at his assigned station, a small rectangle of space marked with yellow tape on the concrete floor. Endless metal parts slid past on the conveyor belt like a river of steel, each piece identical to the last, each one demanding his attention for exactly 3 seconds before disappearing into the mechanical distance. The machines clanked and whirred around him, a mechanical symphony that made his head ache and his ears ring. The sound was relentless, drowning out thought, drowning out everything except the steady rhythm of production. His thoughts kept drifting to his garage, to the familiar smell of motor oil and gasoline, to the satisfaction of feeling an engine come to life under his hands, to the way customers would smile when he handed them their keys and told them everything was fixed. 3 hours into his shift, his back already aching from standing in one position, Wade found himself staring blankly at the passing parts. The monotonous work left too much room for thinking, too much space for regret to creep in like cold air through a crack in the window. He thought about all the years he'd put into his garage, 15 years of building something from nothing, of earning trust one customer at a time, of teaching Ellie to change oil when she was barely tall enough to reach under the hood of his old pickup truck. Had it all been for nothing? The early mornings when he'd arrive before dawn to open up, the late nights spent finishing complicated repairs by the light of a single bulb, the careful budgeting where every dollar had to stretch to cover 2, the prayers whispered over broken engines and empty cash registers, asking for just one more month to turn things around. He'd always believed, truly believed, that hard work and faith would see them through anything. His father had taught him that a man's worth was measured by the sweat on his brow and the honesty in his handshake. But now, standing in this factory that cared nothing for his dreams or his daughter's future, That faith felt as fragile as glass. A sharp buzz jolted him from his thoughts like an electric shock. Red lights flashed along the conveyor line, the alarm that meant he'd missed something important. His stomach dropped as he realized he'd let 3 defective parts slip past while lost in his memories. "Harper!" Carl's voice carried over the machinery, cutting through the industrial noise like a blade. "Pay attention! This isn't some charity case you mess up again and you're out." Wade nodded quickly, heat rising in his cheeks. "Yes, sir. Won't happen again." He forced himself to focus on the endless stream of metal passing before him, fighting the exhaustion that made his eyelids feel heavy as lead. His fingers felt clumsy in the thick work gloves, his eyes burning from the harsh lighting that never dimmed, never changed, never offered relief. When his shift finally ended at dawn, the sky just beginning to blush pink at the horizon, Wade drove home in a daze. His body ached in places he'd forgotten could hurt, and his mind felt fuzzy from the hours of mindless repetition. His boots felt like they were made of lead as he climbed the familiar porch steps, each one a small mountain to conquer. Inside, the house was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the kitchen clock sounds that felt like a blessing after the factory's mechanical roar. The morning light filtering through the windows seemed soft and golden compared to the harsh fluorescence he'd left behind. He checked on Ellie first, as he always did, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing. She slept peacefully in her small bed, her blonde hair spread across the pillow like spun gold. Her stuffed giraffe was tucked under one arm, the same worn toy that had comforted her through her mother's illness and death. Her face was relaxed in sleep, free from the worry lines that had appeared too often lately. On his own pillow, he found a folded piece of paper covered in her careful handwriting. Each letter formed with the precision only a child could manage when something really mattered. The paper was decorated with small drawings of stars and suns, colored in with the crayons she kept in an old coffee can by her bed. "Don't give up, Daddy," it read in purple ink. "The sunrise is still coming. I love you more than all the stars in the sky." Ellie Wade sank onto the edge of his bed, the note trembling in his tired hands as tears blurred his vision. Even in the darkness, even when everything seemed lost, his little girl still believed in tomorrow. Across town in a brightly lit television studio, Judith Maynard sat perfectly straight in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The intense studio lights made her face appear paler than usual, but her eyes burned with determination. She faced the nationally renowned host of American Business Tonight with unwavering focus. "So, Miss Maynard," the host began, leaning forward, "you were CEO of Ridgebank until yesterday. What compelled you to come forward with these allegations?" Judith took a deep breath. "It started with a sandwich," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "A man who had nothing shared half his sandwich with me, not knowing who I was. That simple act of kindness opened my eyes to what our policies were really doing to people." The host's eyebrows rose. "A sandwich?" "Yes." Judith's voice grew stronger. "We sit in our boardrooms and look at spreadsheets, but we never see the faces. We never see the single fathers working their fingers raw to keep their businesses alive. We never see their children drawing pictures of hope while their worlds crumble around them." The camera zoomed in as Judith pulled out a familiar piece of paper, Ellie's crayon drawing of Harper Automotive. This was drawn by a 10-year-old girl who just wanted to save her father's garage, a garage that had served that community for decades. Back in the factory break room, workers began gathering around the small TV mounted in the corner. Wade stood frozen, coffee cup halfway to his lips, as Judith's voice filled the room. "Ridgebank has systematically targeted small businesses in rural communities," Judith continued, her professional demeanor cracking slightly to reveal raw emotion. "We offer loans with predatory terms, knowing full well that economic downturns will force defaults. Then we swoop in, foreclose, and sell to corporate developers at a profit." The host leaned forward. "You say we. You were part of this system." "Yes," Judith admitted, her voice thick with regret. "I was, and that's why I have to speak up now. When I tried to implement changes, a community co-op model, refinancing options, basic human consideration, I was removed from my position. Social media channels exploded as clips of the interview began circulating. Number Judith Speaks Out and number Ridgebank Scandal started trending within hours. What these communities need, Judith continued, is not charity. They need fair treatment. They need banks that serve people, not profit margins. They need—" She paused, collecting herself. "They need to know that kindness isn't a liability." The camera caught a tear sliding down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. "I've brought documentation," she said, holding up a thick folder. "Proof of systematic targeting, internal memos discussing acceptable casualty rates in small business communities, everything." In the factory break room, Wade's co-workers whispered and pointed. The interview continued to play as Judith detailed specific cases, including thinly veiled references to Harper Automotive without naming names. "And what do you hope to achieve by coming forward?" the host asked. "Justice," Judith replied firmly. "I've already been contacted by several legal aid organizations willing to help affected communities fight back. Major donors have reached out about creating a fund for business recovery. But more importantly," she looked directly into the camera, "I want to restore hope." The host nodded gravely. "You're risking a lot by doing this. Your career, possibly legal action from Ridgebank." "Some things matter more than career success," Judith said quietly. "Sometimes you have to risk everything to do what's right." Wade stood motionless, watching as Judith detailed exactly how much money Ridgebank had made from their foreclosure practices. His coffee had grown cold in his hands. "Say," one of his co-workers nudged him, "ain't that the lady from the church? The one who was helping at the food pantry?" Wade nodded slowly, unable to find words. On screen, Judith was now sharing statistics about small business closures and their impact on rural communities. "In many cases," she explained, "these aren't just businesses we're closing. They're community lifelines. They're family legacies. They're—" her voice caught slightly, "they're people's dreams and their children's futures." The interview cut to commercial, but the break room remained buzzing with conversation. Workers pulled out their phones, sharing social media posts about the interview. Someone mentioned that number Save Small Towns was now trending nationwide. "Man," another coworker said, shaking his head, "takes guts to stand up to a big bank like that. She's gonna catch hell for this." Wade finally set down his coffee cup, his hands trembling slightly. He thought of Judith sitting alone on that park bench, accepting half a sandwich from a stranger. He remembered her quiet presence at the church, her anonymous donations, her tears as she handed him that final envelope. "Yeah," he said softly, "she sure is." The break room television switched back to the interview for its conclusion. Judith's final words rang out clear and strong. "These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are real people with real lives. And if speaking out costs me everything I've built, then so be it. Some debts can only be paid with truth." Wade's coworker whistled low. "Ain't that the lady from the church?" he asked again, still processing the revelation. Wade watched the screen fade to black, remembered Ellie's note about the sunrise, and whispered, "Yeah, that's her." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Wade Harper's small living room window as he sat at his kitchen table, sorting through past due notices. His work uniform from the factory night shift lay draped over a chair, waiting for another long evening ahead. Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, working on her homework with determined concentration. A sharp knock at the door made them both look up. Wade's shoulders tensed. Unexpected visitors rarely brought good news these days. He opened the door to find a professionally dressed woman holding a leather briefcase. "Mr. Harper, I'm Sarah Chen from Riverside Legal Services." She extended her hand with a warm smile. "May I come in? I have some important documents to discuss with you." Wade hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside. Ellie peered up from her homework, her pencil frozen mid-equation. "Quote, please, have a seat," Wade offered, gesturing to the kitchen table. His voice carried the weariness of too many sleepless nights. Sarah opened her briefcase and removed a thick manila envelope. "Mr. Harper, I'm here on behalf of Miss Judith Maynard." She paused as Wade's expression darkened at the mention of Judith's name. "Please, hear me out. This is something you'll want to see." She spread several documents across the table. "These are property transfer papers for Harper Automotive. Miss Maynard purchased the property outright from Ridgebank, using her personal funds. She slid the deed forward. She's transferring complete ownership to you, Mr. Harper, free and clear." Wade stared at the papers, his hands trembling slightly as he picked them up. Ellie abandoned her homework and crept closer, her eyes wide with hope. "I don't understand," Wade whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Why would she?" "Miss Maynard was very clear about her wishes," Sarah explained gently. "She wanted to right a wrong. The property is yours, Mr. Harper. No mortgage, no liens, no strings attached." Ellie's face lit up as comprehension dawned. "Daddy, does this mean?" She bounced on her toes, barely containing her excitement. "The garage is yours again. Sarah confirmed with a smile. "All you need to do is sign these papers." Wade sank heavily into a kitchen chair, the documents clutched in his shaking hands. His eyes glistened with tears he couldn't hold back. "This can't be real," he muttered. "It's very real, Mr. Harper." Sarah pulled out a pen and indicated several marked spots on the papers. "Your signature here, here, and here will make it official." Ellie wrapped her arms around Wade's shoulders, pressing her cheek against his. "See, Daddy? I told you the sunrise was coming." Wade's tears fell freely now as he carefully signed each document. His signature was steady despite his trembling hands. Sarah notarized the papers efficiently, then handed Wade a set of copies and a small envelope. "These are your new keys," she said. "The locks were changed for security purposes during the closure. Miss Maynard wanted you to have fresh starts in every way possible." Wade held the envelope like it contained precious gems. In many ways, it did. "Daddy, can we go see it?" Ellie pleaded, practically vibrating with excitement. "Please?" Wade stood slowly, still dazed. "Thank you," he said to Sarah, his voice thick with emotion. "Please, please tell Miss Maynard." Sarah smiled kindly. "I think she knows, Mr. Harper." After Sarah left, Wade and Ellie stood together on their front porch. The late afternoon had mellowed into early evening, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. "Ready?" Wade asked, holding out his hand to Ellie. She grabbed it eagerly, and they began the familiar walk to the garage. Every step felt different now, lighter, filled with possibility instead of dread. Ellie skipped beside him, chattering about all the things they could do now that the garage was theirs again. They rounded the final corner, and there it stood. Harper Automotive looked exactly as they'd left it weeks ago, down to Ellie's hand-painted Hope Garage sign that had somehow survived the closure. Wade's hands trembled slightly as he took out the new keys. He stood before the padlocked door, suddenly overwhelmed by the moment's wait. Ellie squeezed his other hand tight. "It's okay, Daddy," she whispered. "We're home." With a deep breath, Wade slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, the padlock clicking open like a promise kept. He pulled it free, unwound the chain, and reached for the door handle. The morning air buzzed with excitement as pickup trucks and cars lined the street in front of Harper Automotive. Volunteers from all corners of town gathered, armed with paintbrushes, cleaning supplies, and determined smiles. Pastor Neil directed traffic while his wife organized a makeshift refreshment station on a folding table. Wade Harper stood in the doorway of his newly reopened garage, watching in amazement as neighbors he'd known for years pitched in without being asked. Mrs. Peterson from the diner brought her famous coffee cake. Tom Wilson, the hardware store owner, arrived with boxes of supplies he insisted were just laying around anyway. "Daddy, look!" Ellie called out, pointing to a group of high school students who had shown up with paint rollers and drop cloths. The whole basketball team came. Wade's eyes grew misty as he watched his daughter bounce between helper groups, her energy infectious. She wore her favorite overalls, already spotted with fresh white paint, her ponytail swinging as she directed people with the authority of a tiny foreman. "Where do you want the new workbenches, Wade?" called out Mike Thompson, backing up his flatbed truck. The local carpenter had built them himself, refusing payment. "Over by the west wall," Wade answered, his voice thick with emotion. He cleared his throat and added, "But first, let me help you unload." The day unfolded like a well-orchestrated dance. Women from the church quilting circle cleaned windows until they sparkled. The high school kids transformed the dingy walls with fresh paint, while retired mechanics helped Wade reorganize his tools and equipment. By mid-afternoon, someone had fired up a grill in the parking lot. The aroma of hot dogs and hamburgers mixed with the sharp smell of paint and cleaning supplies. Children darted between adults, carrying water bottles and paper plates. Wade paused his work to watch Ellie carefully painting letters on a large wooden sign. Her tongue stuck out slightly in concentration as she filled in the outline someone had sketched. "Ellie's Hope Garage." "That's some mighty fine brushwork there, sweetheart," Wade said, kneeling beside her. Ellie beamed at him. "Do you really like the name, Daddy? I wanted everyone to remember why we didn't give up." Wade pulled her into a tight hug, paintbrush and all. "It's perfect," he whispered into her hair. Over the next few days, Wade implemented changes he'd long dreamed about, but never had the means to accomplish. He cleared space in the corner for a small waiting area, complete with donated chairs and a coffee maker. On the walls, he hung Ellie's drawings alongside automotive diagrams. Word spread quickly about the garage's reopening. By the end of the first week, Wade had already started a special program for senior citizens, offering discounted oil changes and basic maintenance. Mrs. Johnson, who lived on a fixed income, cried when Wade explained she could pay for her brake repair in installments. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said, patting his cheek like she used to when he was a boy in Sunday school. One afternoon, while Wade was showing 17-year-old Danny Peterson how to change spark plugs, he realized something had shifted in his heart. The garage wasn't just about fixing cars anymore. It had become a place of healing for the whole community. "See, Danny," Wade explained, pointing to the engine, "sometimes the simplest solution is the right one. You just have to be patient enough to look for it." The teenager nodded, absorbing not just the mechanical lesson, but something deeper. 3 other high school students watched nearby, waiting for their turn to learn. Wade had started offering free basic automotive lessons after school, teaching kids skills that could serve them well in life. Ellie took to sitting at the front desk after finishing her homework, greeting customers with her bright smile and keeping track of appointments in a notebook decorated with heart stickers. She had a special gift for making nervous customers feel at ease, just like her mother used to do. One particularly busy morning, Wade looked up from an oil change to see Ellie racing across the garage floor, waving an envelope. "Daddy, look what came in the mail." Wade wiped his hands on a shop rag and took the envelope from her trembling fingers. Inside, they found a familiar charm bracelet, the one Judith had given Ellie at the fundraiser. A simple note accompanied it. "This belongs to the girl who brought hope." Ellie's eyes welled up with tears as Wade fastened the bracelet around her wrist. The small charms caught the light streaming through the newly cleaned windows, a heart, a star, and what looked like a tiny wrench. The autumn sun painted the town in warm golden hues as Judith Maynard walked slowly down Main Street. She wore simple jeans and a sweater instead of her usual business attire, trying to blend in with the Sunday morning quiet. Her shoulders tensed as she passed familiar storefronts, wondering if people would recognize her from the TV interview or remember her as the Ridgebank CEO. The church bells chimed in the distance, and she found herself drawn toward their gentle sound. A few cars were parked outside First Community Church, where she'd last seen Wade and Ellie. The memory of that confrontation still made her chest ache. As she approached the church entrance, something caught her eye. There, in the front garden, stood the Hope Tree, larger now than she remembered. Colorful paper leaves fluttered in the breeze, each one carrying someone's testimony of kindness. Judith stepped closer, reading the messages. Her breath caught when she spotted one in a child's handwriting. "My daddy gave his only sandwich away." "It's still Ellie's favorite story," a warm voice said behind her. Judith turned to find Pastor Neil standing there, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. He wore his Sunday best, though his tie was slightly crooked. Pastor Neil, Judith struggled to find the right words. "I wasn't sure if I should come back." "God has perfect timing," he said simply. "Would you join me for lunch? The diner makes a mean pot roast on Sundays." Before she could protest, he was already walking toward Main Street, leaving her little choice but to follow. The bell above Mary's Diner jingled as they entered, and a few heads turned their way. Judith felt her cheeks flush, but the other patrons quickly returned to their meals. They settled into a quiet corner booth, and Mary herself brought them water with lemon. She gave Judith a warm smile and squeezed her shoulder before walking away. "They know what you did," Pastor Neil said softly, noting Judith's surprise. "The whole town does. That interview changed things, not just here, but in communities all across the country." Judith wrapped her hands around the cool water glass. "I had to do something after seeing what the bank's policies were doing to people like Wade." Speaking of Wade, Pastor Neil's eyes twinkled. The garage has become quite the community hub. He's teaching 3 local boys basic auto repair after school, says it keeps them out of trouble and gives them practical skills. "And Ellie?" Judith couldn't help asking. "That girl's got more hope than the rest of us combined," he chuckled. "She set up a little homework station in the garage office, helps other kids with their math while Wade works on cars. They're calling it Numbers and Nozzles." Judith felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I was so afraid I'd made everything worse when the board pushed me out." "Sometimes," Pastor Neil interrupted gently, "we have to lose what we think defines us to find our true purpose. You were a CEO, yes, but what you are now, that's something far more valuable." Their pot roast arrived, steam rising from the plates. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the Sunday crowd's quiet chatter filling the air around them. "The co-op model you proposed," Pastor Neil continued between bites, "other towns are adopting it. 3 banks have already started similar programs. Your interview sparked something bigger than just our little community." Judith pushed a carrot around her plate. "I still feel like I should have done more." Faster. Judith, Pastor Neil set down his fork. Do you remember the Hope Tree message you wrote before everything happened? She shook her head. You wrote, I saw a man share his last sandwich with a stranger. That simple act of kindness changed you. And through you, it's changing others. That's how hope works. One small action rippling outward. Mary brought them coffee and apple pie, refusing to let Judith pay. On the house, honey, she insisted, for helping our Wade keep his shop. After lunch, Pastor Neil walked with Judith partway down Main Street. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and children played hopscotch on the sidewalk nearby. The garage is just around the corner, he said, pausing at the intersection. Wade's usually there on Sundays, doing paperwork and such. Judith's heart quickened. I don't know if he wants to see me. Sometimes, Pastor Neil smiled. We need to let go of our fears and trust in grace. He gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder before heading back toward the church. Judith walked slowly down the street, her footsteps carrying her to the park where it all began. The bench was still there, weathered but solid. She sat down, remembering that cold morning when a stranger had shared his sandwich with her. The leaves rustled overhead, and somewhere a child laughed. Judith closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the weight of the past few months lifting from her shoulders. Here, on this simple wooden bench, her life had changed course, not because of any grand gesture, but because of one man's quiet kindness. She opened her eyes and looked toward Harper Automotive, where the new sign, Ellie's Hope Garage, gleamed in the afternoon light. The autumn breeze rustled through the nearly bare branches as Judith sat alone on the weathered park bench. Her fingers traced the peeling green paint, remembering that first shared sandwich that had changed everything. The morning sun warmed her face, but she shivered slightly, pulling her cream sweater tighter around her shoulders. From across the park, Wade Harper noticed her familiar silhouette. He paused for a moment, watching as she gazed at the ground, lost in thought. The anger that had once burned in his chest had long since faded, replaced by a deep understanding of what she'd risked to help him and the town. He walked toward the bench, his work boots crunching softly on the scattered leaves. Judith looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, her eyes widening with uncertainty. But Wade's face held no trace of bitterness, only a gentle warmth that reached his eyes. He gestured to the empty space beside her. Mind if I join you? Of course not, she said softly, sliding over slightly, though there was plenty of room. Wade sat down, letting out a long breath. They shared a moment of comfortable silence, watching a group of sparrows hop around in the grass before them. Finally, Wade reached into the paper bag he carried and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Thought you might be hungry? He said, his eyes twinkling as he carefully unwrapped it and broke it in half. Seems only fair to return the favor. Judith let out a surprised laugh, the tension in her shoulders melting away. You remembered. Hard to forget the day a fancy bank CEO shared half my peanut butter sandwich, Wade said, holding out one half to her. Though this one's turkey and cheese. Figure we can both afford something a little better these days. She accepted it with grateful hands, and they both took a bite, sharing another peaceful moment together. The simple act felt like healing, like coming full circle. Wade, I need to say something, Judith began, her voice soft but steady. I'm sorry for not being honest with you from the start. I was trying to understand the town, understand you, but I should have. Wade shook his head gently. You showed us who you really were through your actions. That matters more than any title or introduction could have. He brushed a few crumbs from his lap. The garage deed. I don't know how to thank you properly. You already have, Judith replied, meeting his gaze. You showed me what real wealth looks like. It's not in bank accounts or boardrooms. It's in how we treat each other, how we lift each other up. She paused, looking down at her half-eaten sandwich. That first day, when you shared what little you had without hesitation, it changed something in me. Wade nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the smallest kindnesses have the biggest impact, like a certain charm bracelet that gave my daughter hope when she needed it most. I've missed her, Judith admitted, her voice catching slightly. I've missed this town. Even after everything that happened with the bank, I couldn't stay away. This place, these people, they've become home somehow. Well, Wade said, his voice warm, Ellie's Hope Garage could always use a financial advisor, someone who knows their way around a spreadsheet better than I do. He gave her a sidelong glance. The pay's not quite CEO level, mind you. Judith laughed, wiping away a tear that had escaped. I think I could manage with a pay cut, as long as there are sandwich breaks included. Daddy? A familiar voice rang out across the park. They turned to see Ellie running toward them, her purple backpack bouncing against her back, dark hair streaming behind her. She had spotted them from the church steps, where Sunday school had just let out. Before either adult could react, Ellie launched herself at Judith, wrapping her arms around her in a fierce hug. "You came back. I knew you would. I saw your bracelet on my dresser, and I just knew." Judith hugged her back tightly, her eyes meeting Wade's over Ellie's head. His expression was soft, full of gratitude and something else, perhaps hope for the future. "You made Daddy happy again," Ellie whispered in Judith's ear, still holding on tight. The simple words carried the weight of a child's pure observation, striking straight to the heart of what really mattered. The autumn sun continued to shine down on the three of them, its golden light touching the moment with warmth and promise. The old park bench, once just a place for a simple act of kindness between strangers, now held something more, the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. The story of Wade Harper's garage and Judith Maynard's stand against corporate greed had spread far beyond their small town. News outlets picked up the heartwarming tale of redemption, and soon, Judith's phone was ringing with calls from social impact investors and nonprofit organizations. "We've got another donation," Judith announced one morning, standing in what used to be an empty storefront next to Wade's garage. The space hummed with activity as volunteers painted walls and arranged furniture, this time from the Wilson Foundation. "They're matching our first-year operating costs." Pastor Neil, who had stopped by to help, whistled low. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Judith smiled, remembering how different things had been just months ago. She traded her designer suits for casual business wear, and her steel-rimmed glasses now hung from a chain around her neck. The transformation wasn't just external. There was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. The new Highland Community Financial Co-op took shape quickly. Judith insisted on hiring local talent, particularly women who needed second chances. Sarah, a single mother who'd lost her home to foreclosure years ago, became their first loan officer. Maria, who dropped out of college to care for her sick grandmother, signed on as their outreach coordinator. "The key is understanding what people really need," Judith explained during a training session. She stood before a whiteboard covered in financial terms, but her message was simple. Sometimes it's not just money, it's hope, it's dignity, it's someone believing in them. Wade attended these sessions regularly, usually sitting quietly in the back. But when he spoke, everyone listened. His practical wisdom and experience brought reality to their theoretical discussions. "Folks around here don't need fancy financial products," he said during one meeting. "They need fair loans, honest advice, and a chance to prove themselves." The garage became their pilot project, the blueprint for how community-centered financing could work. Wade's books were open for all to study, his struggles, his determination, and finally, his success. Other small business owners started coming by, not just for car repairs, but for hope that their stories could turn around too. Ellie became the co-op's unofficial mascot. She set up a small desk near the entrance, greeting visitors with a gap-toothed smile and offering them lemonade. Her Hope Tree project from school had inspired them to create a success tree in the co-op's lobby, where they hung stories of local businesses they'd helped. The morning of the official ribbon-cutting ceremony dawned bright and clear. The street outside the co-op was packed with townspeople, reporters, and supporters. Judith stood at the podium, her hands steady as she gripped its edges. "This isn't just about money," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "It's about believing that every person deserves a chance to thrive. It's about remembering that sometimes the richest people are the ones who share their last sandwich." Wade stood nearby, Ellie perched on his shoulders. He caught Judith's eye and nodded, remembering that cold morning that felt like a lifetime ago. After the speeches and the ceremonial ribbon cutting, after the cameras stopped rolling and the crowd began to disperse, Judith and Wade found themselves walking side by side down the quiet street. "You know," Wade said, breaking the comfortable silence, "when you first sat down on that bench, I thought you were just another suit from the bank." Judith laughed softly. "I was, but something changed that day." They passed the park where it all began, the old bench still there, its green paint a little more worn. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves. "The co-op board meetings are going to need someone with real mechanical know-how," Judith said, glancing at Wade. "Someone who understands both engines and people." Wade ducked his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Reckon I might know someone who fits that description." They stopped walking, standing in the warm glow of the setting sun. Judith turned to face Wade, her expression open and genuine. "Thank you, Wade, for showing me what real wealth looks like." Wade met her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. A spark of understanding, of shared purpose, and perhaps something more. But neither rushed to name it, content to let it grow naturally, like the hope they'd planted in their community. The moment was broken by Ellie's voice calling from the garage. "Daddy, Miss Judith, come look at the new success tree." They turned together, walking back toward the voices and laughter spilling from the co-op's open doors, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they walked. Behind them, the old park bench stood empty, waiting for the next story to begin. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh popcorn and cotton candy through the town square. 6 months had passed since the dark days of foreclosure notices and closed shops, and the transformation was remarkable. Children's laughter echoed off storefronts with fresh paint, and open signs glowed in windows that had once been boarded up. At Ellie's Hope Garage, Wade Harper stood beside his daughter, watching as she carefully positioned the oil pan under Mrs. Henderson's aging Buick. Her small hands were already showing the telltale signs of a mechanic's life. A smudge of grease here, a tiny scratch there, but her face beamed with pride. "Remember what I taught you about the drain plug?" Wade asked, his voice gentle and encouraging. Ellie nodded, her ponytail bouncing. Lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. She gripped the wrench with determination, her tongue sticking out slightly as she concentrated. Wade's heart swelled as he watched her. These quiet moments in the garage had become their special time together, a father passing down not just skills, but values. The work was honest, the lessons simple but important. Around town, similar scenes of renewal played out daily. The bakery down the street had reopened with help from the co-op, its windows now displaying fresh bread and pastries. The hardware store expanded its inventory, and even the old movie theater was getting a facelift. On this particular Saturday morning, the town was buzzing with activity as volunteers set up for the Hope Day Festival. Streamers in cheerful colors stretched between lamp posts, and handmade banners proclaimed messages of community and perseverance. Pastor Neil supervised the setup of folding chairs in front of a small stage, while church ladies arranged plates of cookies and punch on long tables. Children darted between the growing crowd, their excitement infectious. Wade stood at his workbench, nervously reviewing the speech cards Judith had helped him prepare. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, but when the festival committee asked him to be the keynote speaker, he couldn't refuse. They wanted him to share the story that had sparked their town's revival. "You'll do great, Daddy," Ellie said, wiping her hands on a shop rag. She had changed into a clean dress for the festival, though a tiny grease spot still marked her elbow. By noon, the square was packed. Familiar faces filled every chair, with others standing along the edges. Wade recognized customers whose cars he'd fixed over the years, neighbors who'd brought food during the hard times, and young people who now worked at the co-op. Judith sat in the front row, looking different from the exhausted woman who'd first shared a sandwich. Her corporate suits were gone, replaced by casual clothes that seemed to match her more relaxed smile. She caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod. Mayor Thompson stepped up to the microphone first, welcoming everyone and speaking about the town's journey. Wade barely heard the words, his mind drifting to that cold morning in the park that had changed everything. When his name was called, Wade walked to the podium slowly, his work boots heavy on the wooden stage. He looked out at the sea of faces, his community, his family, and all but blood, and found his voice. 6 months ago, he began, his deep voice steady despite his nerves. "I sat on a park bench with half a sandwich and a mountain of worry. Today, I stand here because that worry turned into hope, and that hope turned into action." He spoke about faith when times were darkest, about a daughter's unwavering belief in miracles, and about strangers becoming friends. His words weren't polished, but they carried the weight of lived experience. "This garage isn't just my story," Wade continued, gesturing toward the building that had become a symbol of their town's resilience. "It belongs to every father who wouldn't give up, every mother who stretched a dollar until it sang, every child who believed in better days." Tears glistened in many eyes as he spoke about community, about how their town had remembered what it meant to be neighbors. He talked about second chances and the courage to extend a helping hand, even when your own grip was slipping. As Wade finished speaking, Ellie slipped away from her seat. She'd been working on something special for days, hidden in the garage's back room. Now, with help from Pastor Neil, she carried a large wooden sign toward the garage's front wall. The crowd followed, gathering around as Ellie and Wade together hung the sign she'd painted. The letters were careful and clear, decorated with small hearts and wrenches. It started with a sandwich. Wade wrapped his arm around his daughter's shoulders, both of them looking up at the sign. It was more than just words on wood. It was their story, their testament to how the smallest act of kindness could grow into something beautiful. The sign would hang there as a reminder to everyone who passed by. Hope could start with something as simple as sharing what little you had. It would remind them that even in their darkest moments, kindness was always affordable, and miracles often began with a single generous act. The metal ladder creaked softly under their weight as Wade helped Ellie climb onto the garage roof, his weathered hands steady and sure as they guided her small frame upward. Each rung groaned a familiar protest, the same sound it had made for 15 years. A comforting constant in their ever-changing world. Judith followed carefully behind them, balancing 3 steaming cups of hot chocolate in a cardboard tray that Sarah from the flower shop had decorated with hand-drawn hearts. The pre-dawn air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of dew-kissed grass and the promise of winter's approach. It held that special stillness that comes just before sunrise, a hushed reverence that made even the boldest souls speak in whispers. "Careful now, sweetheart," Wade said, his voice low and gentle as he kept a protective hand on Ellie's shoulder. They settled together onto the old patchwork quilt he'd spread out earlier, the same one his late wife had sewn from scraps of Ellie's outgrown dresses and his worn work shirts. The fabric still held memories in its faded patterns. A piece of Ellie's first Easter dress, a corner of the shirt he'd worn to their wedding. The town stretched below them like a living map. Peaceful and quiet in the soft blue-gray light that comes before dawn breaks the world open with color. Scattered across the valley, a few early risers had already switched on their porch lights, creating tiny islands of warmth that dotted the landscape like fallen stars. Mrs. Rodriguez was already moving around in her kitchen, the yellow glow from her window promising fresh tortillas for anyone who might stop by. Old Mr. Thompson sat on his front steps with his coffee, watching the world wake up the way he had every morning for 40 years. Ellie snuggled between Wade and Judith, her small body fitting perfectly in the space between their shoulders like a missing puzzle piece finding its home. She accepted her cup of hot chocolate with both hands, wrapping her fingers around the warmth and breathing in the rich, sweet steam that rose from the surface. "It's like we can see the whole world from up here," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the morning's sacred spell. Her eyes were wide with wonder, reflecting the soft light like 2 bright stars. "Sure feels that way, doesn't it, little bird?" Wade smiled, wrapping his strong arm around his daughter and pulling her close. The eastern sky was beginning to show the first tentative hints of pink and gold, colors bleeding into the darkness like watercolors on wet paper. The horizon seemed to glow from within, as if someone had lit a candle behind the distant hills. Judith pulled her cable-knit sweater tighter around her shoulders and took a slow, thoughtful sip from her cup. The sweetness of the chocolate mingled with something deeper, a contentment she'd never known in all her years of corporate success. "I used to watch sunrises from my office on the 30th floor," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of memory. Floor-to-ceiling windows, panoramic, views of the city skyline. But they never felt like this. They were just pretty pictures through glass, beautiful but distant, like watching life on television instead of living it. Wade nodded slowly, his understanding coming from years of working with his hands instead of sitting behind a desk. "Sometimes you have to come down to earth to really see the sky," he said, his voice carrying the simple wisdom that had drawn both women to him. "The higher up you go, the further away everything else gets." The first ray of true sunlight peeked over the horizon like a shy child stepping into a room, painting everything in gentle gold that seemed to transform the ordinary into the miraculous. Below them, the town was coming alive with the quiet rhythm of a community that had learned to value each new day. Mr. Peterson was already opening his bakery, the rich smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls drifting up to them on the morning breeze. The warm, yeasty scent mixed with the clean smell of morning dew and the faint perfume of Sarah's flowers. Sarah herself was just stepping out of her shop, arranging buckets of fresh blooms on the sidewalk with the careful attention of someone who understood that beauty was a gift meant to be shared. Bright yellow mums, deep purple asters, and the last roses of the season created a rainbow of color against the weathered brick storefront. "Remember when you gave away your sandwich, Daddy?" Ellie asked, her voice small but clear in the morning, quiet, cutting through the gentle sounds of the waking town. Her question hung in the air like morning mist, simple but profound. That's when everything started changing, wasn't it? Wade glanced at Judith, catching her eye in that moment of shared understanding that had become as natural as breathing between them. Her face was soft with memory and wonder, touched by the golden morning light that made her look younger somehow. More like the hopeful girl she might have been before the world taught her to build walls around her heart. "That feels like a lifetime ago," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so lost that day, sitting in my expensive car, wearing my designer suit, and yet I was starving, hungry in ways that had nothing to do with food, empty in places I didn't even know existed." "We all were," Wade replied gently, his thumb absently stroking Ellie's shoulder through her jacket. "Sometimes the Lord works in ways we'd never expect. Who'd have thought that half a peanut butter sandwich could start all this? Sometimes the smallest seed grows the biggest tree." Ellie pointed toward the community center, its brick walls now painted a warm cream color that caught the morning light like honey. "And now you help people learn about money, and Daddy teaches kids about cars, and Pastor Neil has his youth group, and everyone helps each other. It's like the whole town is one big family now." The sun climbed higher, casting long, dramatic shadows across the fine town square like fingers reaching toward the new day. The morning light caught the brass bell in the church steeple, making it shine like a beacon that could be seen from miles away. Pastor Neil would be in his small office now, preparing for morning prayers with the same quiet dedication he'd shown through all the dark times and bright ones alike. His faith as steady as the sunrise itself. Wade closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun wash over his weathered face. His voice was quiet but steady, carrying the same strength that had held his family together through every storm. "Lord, we thank you for second chances and new beginnings, for bringing light when things seem darkest, for showing us that hope isn't just a word we say, but something we build together, day by day, choice by choice." Judith reached over and squeezed his hand, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. Her eyes glistened with tears that caught the sunlight like diamonds. But her smile was radiant, the kind of joy that comes from finding home in the most unexpected places. "I spent my whole life chasing what I thought was success," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Corner offices and quarterly reports and board meetings. But I never knew peace until now, until this town, until..." She looked at Wade and Ellie, her heart too full for words, leaving the rest unsaid but perfectly understood. The sun was fully above the horizon now, bathing everything in warm golden light that seemed to transform the ordinary streets and buildings into something magical. Main Street glowed like liquid honey, the fresh paint on the storefronts gleaming as if the buildings themselves were smiling. The hope tree in the churchyard cast dappled shadows on the grass, its branches heavy with hundreds of colorful ribbons and handwritten messages of kindness and courage that fluttered gently in the morning breeze like prayers made visible. Ellie pointed excitedly to a flock of birds wheeling overhead, their wings catching the sunlight as they danced through the clear blue sky. "Look, they're dancing in the sunshine. They're so happy to see the new day." Wade watched his daughter's face, seeing in it the same pure joy that had been his anchor through the hardest times, the same unwavering heart that had never stopped believing in goodness, even when the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. Her smile was like sunshine itself, warming everything it touched and reminding him daily why every struggle had been worth it. Below them, more townspeople were emerging to start their day, moving with the unhurried pace of people who had learned to savor simple pleasures. They called cheerful greetings to each other across the street, stopped to chat on corners about small victories and shared concerns, gathered in little groups to share coffee and conversation and the comfortable intimacy of neighbors who had become family. The community that had almost been lost forever was now stronger than ever, bound together not just by shared geography, but by shared struggle and triumph. "No act of kindness is ever wasted," Judith said softly, her words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. She was echoing the simple truth Wade had shared with her that first day on the park bench, when she'd been a stranger in an expensive suit, and he'd been just a mechanic with a generous heart. And sometimes, the smallest things save everything that matters. The morning sun rose higher in the clear blue sky, its rays growing stronger and warmer with each passing moment. It cast its golden light over the transformed town below, touching every roof and window and doorway with the promise of hope renewed. In its warm glow, the shadows of past troubles seemed to fade like bad dreams in daylight, leaving only the bright promise of what lay ahead for all of them. The town sparkled in the morning light like a jewel cradled in the palm of the valley, precious beyond measure and worth every struggle it had taken to save it. From their perch on the garage roof, Surrounded by the warmth of love and the promise of new beginnings, it looked like paradise itself, a testament to the miraculous power of faith, community, and simple acts of kindness shared between strangers who had become family. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Wade Harper, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.